During World War II, thousands of musicians across Europe were taken prisoner by the Nazis. Among them were professional violinists, pianists, and composers who once filled Europe's great concert halls. When they arrived at concentration camps such as Auschwitz and Birkenau, their identities were stripped away. But in a strange twist of history, their talent became a tool for survival. Nazi officers, obsessed with order and propaganda, ordered the creation of orchestras inside the camps. These ensembles were forced to play music during roll calls, work marches, and official visits. What began as another form of control became one of the most unusual and haunting chapters of the war. The story of prisoners who played music in the shadow of death. The instruments were taken from confiscated belongings or found broken in storage. Strings were replaced with wire. Bows were repaired with thread. The first practices happened inside freezing barracks. The players stood shoulder to shoulder, wearing striped uniforms, holding instruments that barely worked. Yet when the first notes sounded, something powerful happened. The music echoed across the camp yard, fragile but real. It reminded everyone listening, even for a few seconds, that humanity still existed inside the fences. The most known of these groups was the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, led by Alma Rosé, an accomplished violinist and the niece of composer Gustav Mahler. She demanded discipline and precision because she knew mistakes could cost lives. The orchestra played marches for prisoners walking to work, evening concerts for the guards, and sometimes music while new arrivals were unloaded from trains. Every performance was survival. Playing meant food rations, slightly better conditions, and a delay from the gas chambers. For the women, the violin or cello became a lifeline, a thin wall between them and death. But the music was never free. Each melody carried guilt. They played while others suffered and died around them. Some described it as a punishment disguised as mercy, the unbearable duty of creating beauty in a place built for destruction. Still, the orchestra members understood one thing clearly: as long as they could play, they could live. In that terrible calculation, music became both a weapon and a shield. The orchestra became a daily part of life inside Auschwitz. Every morning, as prisoners marched out for forced labor, the women played military marches to keep the line moving in rhythm. At night, when exhausted groups returned, they played again, sometimes for hours, until the guards were satisfied. The purpose was control. The sound of music helped maintain order and hide the noise of suffering. For the SS officers, it was a display of discipline. For the prisoners, it was another reminder of how cruelly life and death had been twisted together. The musicians performed in freezing wind, under rain, and beside the chimneys where smoke rose from the crematoria.
Even as they played, they could smell burning flesh in the air. Inside the barracks, practice sessions were strict and relentless. Alma Rose pushed the group to play perfectly, knowing that any mistake could draw punishment or death. Survivors later said she saved their lives through her discipline. To be part of the orchestra meant protection, not comfort, but a few small advantages that could make the difference between survival and starvation. They had slightly more food, a bit more sleep, and protection from hard labor. Yet even in those small mercies, there was fear. Every performance was a test. If the guards grew tired of the music, or if they wanted to punish someone, any musician could be sent away.
Music became a strange language in the camp. It was both forced and voluntary, mechanical and emotional. When they played German marches, they did so to stay alive. But when they secretly rehearsed classical pieces after hours, it became something else entirely, a quiet act of resistance. Some women recalled that those private moments, playing works by Schubert or Chopin, felt like breathing for the first time in months. The melodies reminded them of who they were before the war: teachers, students, daughters, mothers. The same notes that once filled concert halls now whispered inside the barbed wire. At times, the orchestra was ordered to play when new transports arrived at the camp. Trains full of frightened families stepped down onto the platform, and the first thing they heard was music. The guards used the orchestra to create an illusion, to make the arrivals believe this was a work camp, not a place of death. Many musicians could not bear this role. They saw faces filled with confusion and terror, people who would be gone within hours. Still, they played. There was no choice. One survivor later said, "The music followed them and us into silence." It was a burden that never left them. Alma Rose was the force that held the orchestra together. Before the war, she had been one of Vienna's most talented violinists, performing across Europe with her own ensemble. When the Nazis invaded, her career ended overnight. She was Jewish, and that fact alone sealed her fate. After her arrest and transport to Auschwitz, she arrived as prisoner number 50381. But the guards soon discovered who she was. They brought her to lead the newly formed women's orchestra, a position that placed her in one of the most complex and dangerous roles inside the camp. She was both a prisoner and a protector, commanding respect from her players while negotiating with their captors. Under Alma's leadership, the orchestra became a disciplined unit. She demanded excellence, not out of pride, but necessity. Every wrong note could mean punishment. The musicians practiced in bitter cold, using cracked instruments and makeshift sheet music. Many were too weak to stand for long rehearsals, yet Alma pushed them to continue. She understood that their survival depended on the orchestra's reputation. The better they played, the more the SS valued them, and the longer they lived. Survivors later said that Alma's strictness saved dozens of lives. She made them focus on something beyond fear, something structured and human. But Alma's power came with heavy responsibility. She negotiated food rations, pleaded for medicine, and shielded her players from random violence whenever she could. Some guards respected her, others despised her. In the chaos of Auschwitz, even the smallest act of defiance carried risk. When Alma demanded better conditions for the women or refused to let a guard interrupt rehearsal, she risked her own life each time. Yet she continued, believing that music gave her players a reason to survive another day.
Not everyone in the camp understood the orchestra's role. To other prisoners, the musicians seemed privileged. They were fed, housed, and spared from heavy labor, while others suffered outside. This created tension and guilt among the orchestra members. They knew their survival came at a terrible cost, playing music while others walked to their deaths. Still, they shared a bond that went beyond the camp. Each rehearsal was a fragile balance between life and morality. Alma Rosé carried that burden until her final days. In April 1944, she fell ill, possibly from food poisoning, and died suddenly. The orchestra was devastated. Without her, many believed their protection would end. Yet, even after her death, her influence endured. Her musicians continued to play, holding on to the discipline and hope she had taught them. After Alma Rosé's death, the orchestra continued under the direction of other prisoners, but her absence changed everything. The group had lost its heart, yet the routines of the camp left no space for mourning. The SS still expected perfect performances. Every morning, the women gathered their damaged instruments and stood by the gates, playing marches as the columns of prisoners moved out to work. The guards demanded rhythm and precision, not emotion. The women played through hunger, fever, and fear. They learned to perform automatically, their fingers moving by instinct, while their minds tried to escape the horrors around them. Music became their armor, a thin barrier between their souls and the cruelty of the camp. For many, those melodies became a way to measure time. Each song marked another day survived. Between rehearsals, the women practiced quietly in their bunks, whispering notes under their breath. The orchestra room became their only refuge, the one place where the rules of art still existed. Inside, they were musicians again, not numbers, not prisoners. The sound of a violin tuning, a bow sliding across strings, reminded them of life before the war. Even the simplest song carried meaning. It was proof that something human had not yet been destroyed.
Despite the danger, some members found moments of quiet defiance. They sometimes played small fragments of forbidden works, pieces by Jewish composers or romantic melodies banned by the regime. These secret gestures carried deep weight. In a world ruled by violence, a single forbidden note was an act of rebellion. Survivors later recalled how they would close their eyes while playing and imagine the concert halls of Vienna or Krakow. For a few minutes, the fences disappeared, and they felt free. The orchestra's performances also had a strange effect on the guards. Some treated the musicians with curiosity, even admiration, as if art could exist separately from the brutality they enforced. Others saw it only as entertainment, a way to show power. They would request specific songs or demand encores after a day of executions. The contrast between the music and the death surrounding it became unbearable for many players. Still, they played on, trapped in a cruel paradox, using beauty to survive inside a system built on destruction. Through their endurance, the orchestra became more than a group of performers. They became living witnesses, recording history, not on paper, but in sound. As the months passed, word of the orchestra spread quietly through the camp. Prisoners in distant barracks whispered about the women who played for their lives. Sometimes, faint music could be heard drifting across the yard, fragments of marches, broken harmonies swallowed by the wind. For many inmates, that sound carried mixed meaning. It was proof that someone inside the camp could still create beauty, but also a painful reminder of the twisted order the Nazis had built. The melodies echoed between wooden huts and barbed wire, carried by smoke rising from the chimneys. Survivors later described those sounds as both haunting and comforting, the last traces of humanity within a place designed to erase it. Outside Auschwitz, similar orchestras existed in other camps, in Treblinka, Majdanek, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen. Each was forced to perform under brutal conditions, but all shared the same paradox: music as both punishment and preservation. The Germans used these groups for propaganda, claiming to treat their prisoners humanely. Photographs showed musicians in neat uniforms performing with smiles. Behind those images was another truth. Every smile was rehearsed, every photo staged, every note a matter of life and death. In the final winter of the war, when supplies ran short and disease spread rapidly, the orchestra's performances became less frequent. Instruments broke beyond repair. Hunger weakened the players, yet they continued whenever ordered. Some women were transferred or killed during evacuations. Others survived long enough to see the guards flee. When the Red Army approached in early 1945, chaos consumed the camp. The orchestra room fell silent for the last time, its cracked instruments left behind as fragments of a story no one outside
yet understood.
When Soviet troops entered Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, they found evidence of unimaginable horror. Amid the ruins were scattered sheets of music, torn violins, and handwritten arrangements. For the soldiers, these items seemed trivial compared to the human tragedy surrounding them. But for the few surviving musicians, they were symbols of endurance. Many could barely speak about what they had endured. They were alive, yet hollow, carrying memories that words could not contain. The liberation that ended their imprisonment also opened a lifetime of silence. Some survivors returned to their homelands to find nothing left. Families gone, homes destroyed, names erased. Many never played music again. Others forced themselves back to the stage, determined to reclaim the art that had once defined them. For them, performing after Auschwitz was not about fame. It was about proving that the Nazis had failed to destroy their humanity. A few found solace in small concerts for fellow survivors in displaced persons camps. Each performance was both healing and unbearable. The same instruments that had saved their lives now reminded them of those who had not been saved. The post-war years brought little recognition. The world wanted to move forward, not look back at orchestras that had played beside gas chambers. For decades, their story remained buried in memories, diaries, and scattered testimonies. It was only later, when historians and survivors began to speak publicly, that the strange truth of those camp orchestras came to light. In 1945, a group of Jewish musicians who had survived multiple camps came together at the St. Ottilien Monastery in Bavaria. They formed what became known as the Ex-Concentration Camp Orchestra. It was the first ensemble of its kind, a gathering of survivors determined to transform their pain into purpose. With help from Allied soldiers and humanitarian organizations, they found instruments, uniforms, and a stage. Their first concert, played before other displaced persons and military officials, was described as both tragic and triumphant. The musicians performed classical works once banned by the Nazis, and they played them with fierce pride. The orchestra toured displaced persons camps across the American occupation zone. Audiences wept openly as they listened. For the first time since the war began, music was no longer a command from a guard, it was a choice. These performances were acts of reclamation, turning forced obedience into freedom of expression. Many of the musicians still bore tattooed numbers on their arms. They performed wearing simple uniforms that resembled the ones they had worn in captivity, not as costume, but as testimony. Every concert declared, "We are still here." Their story spread slowly, inspiring other survivor musicians throughout Europe. In these makeshift halls, amid ruins and hunger, the sound of violins and clarinets became a kind of resurrection. For a few years, the orchestra traveled from camp to camp until its members were resettled in Israel, the U.S., and other countries. Some joined new orchestras, others retired from music altogether.
But wherever they went, they carried a message born from the ashes of Auschwitz, that art could survive even the worst evil imaginable.
The history of these orchestras forces difficult questions. Can music remain pure when played under coercion? Can art coexist with atrocity? Survivors themselves rarely agreed. Some described their performances as survival, others as unbearable guilt. One former cellist said she could never touch her instrument again. Another continued playing until old age, saying music had kept her sane. What united them was not opinion, but endurance. They had been made to serve cruelty, and somehow transformed it into a fragment of humanity. For decades, archives contained only a few testimonies. It took researchers and surviving members in the 1970s and 1980s to piece together the full record: names, dates, instruments, scores. Documentaries and memorial projects later preserved their story. Visitors to Auschwitz today can still see photographs of the orchestra. Women standing in striped uniforms, violins in hand, a conductor before them. To modern eyes, the image is almost impossible to process. Art inside a death camp. Yet that contradiction is exactly why their memory endures. The moral weight of their music cannot be separated from its setting. They played under duress, but their sound outlasted the orders that created it. The Nazis used music to mock life. The prisoners used it to preserve it. Out of that conflict came one of history's strangest testaments. Proof that even forced art can carry truth when born of survival. In later years, surviving musicians began to share their memories publicly. They appeared in interviews, museums, and schools, their voices trembling with age, but filled with clarity. They spoke of the cold mornings, the endless rehearsals, the fear of playing a wrong note. They described how Alma Rosi's strictness had saved them, how music had given structure to chaos. Many still remembered the faces of those who never made it out, fellow players, friends, and listeners who vanished overnight. Some survivors returned to visit the camps decades later. Standing where the orchestra once performed, they described hearing phantom echoes, the faint rhythm of marches, the vibration of strings in the wind. For them, those sounds were not ghosts, but memories, proof that their suffering had meaning because it had been witnessed. They did not call themselves heroes. They called themselves survivors of circumstance. Their strength was quiet, not celebrated. It existed in their decision to keep living, to tell the truth, and to keep music alive for those who could not. Their testimonies became vital to understanding the Holocaust beyond numbers and statistics. They revealed the emotional reality of survival, the compromises, the guilt, and the will to remain human when every system tried to erase humanity itself. Through their stories, the orchestra's legacy transformed from tragedy into education. It became a lesson about resilience, culture, and the fragile boundaries between art and survival. Today, the story of the prisoner orchestras is recognized as one of the most haunting episodes of the Second World War. Museums, memorials, and educational projects continue to preserve their memory. Yet beyond the history books lies a deeper message. These musicians did not play for glory or for audiences. They played to hold on to life itself. Their music was not triumph, but resistance in its simplest form, the refusal to be silenced. When visitors walk through the ruins of Auschwitz now, they see empty barracks, rusted fences, and piles of instruments recovered from the camps. Some violins have names carved inside them. Others remain anonymous. Each one represents a voice that once spoke through melody instead of words. Standing there, it is impossible not to imagine the sound that once filled the air. Thin, trembling notes fighting against the noise of war. That sound, though long gone, still carries through history. The orchestras of the camps remind us that culture and cruelty can coexist in horrifying ways, but they also prove that the human spirit can survive even when everything else is stripped away. The women and men who played those instruments came as prisoners and left as witnesses. Their music did not end with liberation. It continues in every story told, every lesson taught, every song performed in their memory. This is their symphony, a melody written not in ink, but in endurance, echoing across generations.